Hello. Howdy. I picked that song, Writer, performed by Ellie, and I wanted you to see the words, because sometimes when we have lyrics, we think we know what they're saying, but we don't really know what they're saying. I wanted us to all know what was being said, so that we could be conscious of it. Because I wanted to model some of what I'm talking about today. This month, Mykal may well have alerted you that the theme is beauty, nature, art, and aesthetics. And underlying that is Mary's perhaps least favorite activity, the notion of ourselves as creators. The notion of ourselves as being vehicles, vessels, means through which creativity expresses. Oftentimes, that can be a profoundly challenging notion. However, there was one point where there was no sense of challenge with creativity. In today's talk, I want to look at three things. I want to look at self-expression and how that is one of the avenues towards beauty and creativity. I want to look at expansion, the expansion that comes with creativity. And finally, I want to look at the unlimited potential that becomes available when expression and expansion are married in us and in our lives. Cheryl, you talked about finding the Science of Mind text, and you identified, maybe I'll be able to understand what's in it. I think that that approach to it captures this whole notion of creativity better than anything. Many times when we think of creativity, our minds immediately go to that artist. Last week I was at, well actually this week, although last week if you look at the calendar, this week if you look at the past 7 days, I was at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is a world-renowned museum. And I was in this section on the Mykals. And it's the word from which mogul comes. I was telling a little bit to Tan that I had no idea that the whole Indian subcontinent had been profoundly impacted by the Arabian culture. Now, I should have known this because half of India was a Muslim community and half of India was a Hindi community. And then there was a merge of religions there that happened. And in fact, India had been a very ecumenical place. One of the things that I discovered when I was at the museum was that one of the first rulers of the Mughal clan, arrived. He brought with him the artisans of the palaces from Arabia. That was what made them a palace. It was not only having warfare and people who could conduct warfare, it also included artists. Now, sometimes I think the notion of being an artist can be overwhelming. They can do that, but what can I do? The thing that was inspirational about that first person who brought all of those artists was that his son could not read. So they had all of the artists who could write and illustrate these beautiful books, but the son could not read. But the son didn't just leave reading by the side. He basically decided to create the first experience of manga. The first experience where everything was illustrated. So that was the way that he could get it. Despite all that his teachers had tried, it was by illustrating these beautiful stories that it was available. So rather than deposing literature, this person decided to embrace it in a new way, and I would say in a creative way. His inability opened a space for a new form of communication. So I invite us with the notion of expression. That notion that we are artists can feel overwhelming. And yet, when you give a little kid a placemat, a blank placemat, and 4 crayons, you will never see fear. You will never see a backing away. You see the holding on of those crayons, and you see just action happening. All of us have been there, have done that. And then something along the way might have put a kibosh on that. Perhaps it was a contest. I thought I was really fabulous, so I entered my Easter egg coloring contest into the meat store that was hosting it, and I was not first place, I was not second place, I was not on honorable mention. You try enough of those contests, and suddenly your own sense of myself as an artist dissipates, because I started to depend on other people's judgment of my own expression. So the first piece is to look at that call to expression and to decide, will I take the judgment of others and let that put a kibosh on my expression, or will I become aware of it? Will I stop, drop, and roll away from the judgment and into more and new expression? Nancy, you described the ability to be a place where people come and where they listen. And you also described a desire to respond in a way that is self-sustaining, that builds life, and that lets you be a vehicle, a means to which spirit can express, rather than simply being the limited cup. And that you give it your all, and once you've given it your all, there's nothing left of you. How many times have any of us found ourselves giving and giving and giving and giving, and not knowing that there was another source rather than our own ego? Rather than our own sense of, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that. And we keep doing that. We keep saying yes, and we keep saying yes, and then there's nothing left. Just like the person with the reading disability in Mykal, India, found a way around what he couldn't do. Oftentimes, those limits on our self-expression draw our attention. And they call us to do one of 2 things: to quit or to figure out a new way. So I, again, thank you. Just as I thank Cheryl, I thank you for saying there is a new way. Artistry, creativity, beauty is nothing other than looking at things in a new way, seeing things in a new way, letting ourselves enter the same old, but seeing it anew. It's as simple as a breath in. So try it. Everybody take a deep breath in. Let it sit for a moment, and then breathe it out. You know what? You have never had that breath before. And you will never have that breath again. By paying attention to each breath that you pay attention to, there is something that changes. That process of observing changes. It can bring a peacefulness. Now, we're all going on breathing, and I'm not saying, are you breathing? Are you breathing? Are you breathing? We're all doing it. We all do it all the time. And that process of conscious watching brings in something new. Mykal saw a video that talked about the process of meditation. And this process of meditation, they were very clear. This is not something complicated. It's very simple. Can I just pay attention to this one thing? Can I just be still for 5 minutes, for 2 minutes, for 1 minute? Can I be still for that long? And just pay attention to my breath. Can I pay attention to where it's coming in? Can I pay attention to my diaphragm? Do I pay attention to the feeling in my throat? Where do I pay attention? And the magical thing is that in that act of paying attention, all of the things that we have been thinking about land. They come in like mosquitoes to a person in the middle of a field. You go out, you do not have your insecticide. Every thought, everything that you've never imagined comes forward in that attempt. And the whole loveliness of meditation, the whole loveliness of giving a greater space for self-expression is that we get inundated. And that seeming failure is really an opportunity to be able to say, okay, look at you, cute idea, slip it in there. Wow, I didn't know you were there. It becomes a moment of discovery. Now we can respond with judgment and say, oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? I cannot do this simple thing of just paying attention to my breath. Oh, I'm a failure. That's the same thing as when I didn't win that contest at the meat house. I let the judgment of others come in. With expressing ourselves, the notion is to express and delight in it. To just take a moment and appreciate that we have this opportunity to express. It's our nature. It's our very nature to express. It's our very nature to see and seek and find beauty. Now, what we call beauty can be any number of things. It can be a song that we're listening for. Have any of you ever come to a radio and you turn it on and you want to listen to something? Have any of you ever turned the dial? And you turn the dial and you turn the dial and then something hits you. That something hitting you is something that is beautiful. Or something that captures our interest or captures our attention. There was all that other stuff, but there's that one thing or those two things that suddenly capture our attention. So there is this inverse relationship. We are in a world that constantly gives us input, gives us information. And we are receivers of it. This reciprocal relationship between a world out there and a world in here. How many of you have ever found someone that likes everything exactly what you like? Probably not. And the whole point is that each of us are a unique, individualized expression of spirit. We are called to express. We are called to take in what the world has to offer. Each one of us in a unique fashion. And rather than setting some standard, well, if I were really an artist, then this would be what happened. If I was really a writer, then I would have more published books. Or my emails would be getting so many responses, or I would be having publishers just knocking on my door. We set these standards that limit self-expression rather than enhancing self-expression. So my first invitation for you this week is just pay a little bit more attention to where we are called to express. Is it expressing by hearing a song, by seeing something as we're driving by, by finding, I don't know, when you're on a walk, that there's just this little pet that just really interests you. That all of these are creative impulsions. All of these are means through which creativity and through which artistry happens. And rather than setting the bar at something else and saying, oh, I'm not creative, you all know that we live in a world with oxygen and carbon dioxide. We know that the plants in here are using our carbon dioxide. Do you think the plants are judging the nature of our carbon dioxide? I don't really think that's adequate, so I'm just going to die. That's not how life works. That notion of judgment is a very human judgment. Just pay attention. Pay attention to our self-expression. Pay attention to our judgments. And then make the choice, moment by moment. Will I judge this negatively? And if I do, it'll just be like a meditation. Look at that. I was judging myself negatively. Wasn't that cute? I'm still carrying that little thing on my shoulder here. Thank you. I'm noticing that. I am going to do something different next time. And then we do it again. We're like, oh, look at that. I did it again. You are very good. You can even praise that judge. And that doesn't have to stop us. The second area I'd like to have us look at, hit it, maestro, is the notion of expansion. So, in this thing, we should be centered in the divine within ourselves, and then expand in all ways. With that notion of expression, expansion is a natural outcome. That's what so many of the stories of creation are about. In the story of Genesis, which is a particular tradition from the Torah, the Jewish tradition, creation doesn't start with this abundance. It starts pretty stark. In the beginning, there was just darkness. And then there was light. Whoa, and that was the first day. Woo! And it goes on, and each day of creation is an expansion of life, an expansion of creativity. And this was how the early Hebrew people saw this, actually before they were even Hebrew. And they had adapted and adopted things from other cultures. So many cultures came up with ways to describe how all that is could be. And that description is actually an act of expansion. In our modern world, we look at those stories and we say, were those cute? Wasn't that just interesting that people came up with those stories? Because now we have real science. We know what really happened was the Big Bang. There was a singularity, and out of the singularity, all of creation exploded. And yet, at this point, that is a scientific story of the process. And that scientific story of the process gives us a way to look at the stars at the farthest reach of the heavens as far as our equipment will allow us to see. And it gives us a way to explain that vastness that has intrigued and mystified all of humanity from the time that anybody could talk about it. Look up there. Wow, that's a lot. That was probably something along the lines of the very first noticing. Those stories, they are places of expanding us. We have a choice about the kinds of stories that we tell ourselves. So the second thing that I invite us to do is to just pay attention. Is this story that I am speaking about my life, is the story about this moment, is my story, is my account something that expands or something that contracts? With these words, do I make the world bigger? Is there more inclusion by this? or is it shutting it out? I'll give you an example of something that has triggered a sense of being shut out. I've talked before about the notion of Black Lives Matter. Well, it has triggered this response. Well, all lives matter. Of course all lives matter. How can you say Black Lives Matter? The issue is that it's to become conscious that Black lives actually do matter. And to stop the automatic sense that they matter less. But to say that they actually matter. We have the same reactivity, we have the same constriction with the notion of women's rights. Well, why should women have rights? Men have rights too. Well, men have grabbed rights since the takeover from the matriarchy to the patriarchy. Yeah, there was a long time that women were in charge and men were subjugated. It's hard to believe. It's very hard to believe, and yet that was the predominant cultural motif. And then there was a shift in culture, and suddenly the female was denigrated and the male was raised. In my opinion, those kinds of stories both constricted the worlds rather than expanded the worlds. And again, in my opinion, the notion of women's rights is a reclamation saying that men and women, and in fact, one of the things that's going on in the gay, lesbian, transgendered, blah, blah, blah communities is the notion of letting go of the bipolarization of gender as male or female. Because there are cultures where there are men who want to do the things that women do, and they don't want to identify as male just because they were physically born with a particular set of body parts, and women who identify much more in another capacity, and rather than to be held down with a label, held down with one or the other. Western cultures is one of the only places that has done that. There have been many more cultures that have had a much broader sense, and they have not diminished humanity into male or female. They haven't divided the world. In that process of division, rather than expanding, we may be contracting and constricting. So the second invitation for this week is to look. Is the story that I'm telling expansive or constricting? What's the outcome? How do people respond? Sometimes it may not be to embrace you and say, I so love that you are bringing that forward. Just because somebody doesn't love it does not mean that you are not expanding. You may remember there were courts that ordered that a little black girl could go to a school where no little black girl had ever gone before. And the National Guard had to escort her to school. People complained and said, this has never happened before. They didn't like it. Expansion is not always greeted with applause and delight and woohoos. Do we have the courage to be divine vehicles of expansion? If we're not finding the courage, one of the things that Ellie called for in the song is about asking for help. Many of us have been raised with the notion of do it yourself. You're only good if you can do it yourself. The notion of expansion can also mean we expand how we connect with others. It can mean that we respond by saying, I don't know yet, rather than, oh, I've got that answer. It can mean I need to turn to others and seek support. It can mean I'm one of many, rather than I'm the everything. If we go to the last picture. Again, these are just ways of thinking about things. Here you see, I am powerful. I would bet that 50 years ago, this picture would raise quite a ruckus. To see a brown person and in front of their face the words, I am powerful. And yet for more than 50 years, back to when Earnest Holmes first started teaching. And we go back beyond Earnest Holmes because Earnest Holmes drew from the foundations and teachings of others. He drew from Emma Curtis Hopkins. He drew from Thomas Troward. He drew from Emerson. He drew from the texts of the Indian subcontinent, the Bhagavad Gita. He drew from stories of the Bible. This notion of I am powerful, one of the things is we are taught, we are reacquainted with the idea of unlimited potential. The notion of God is omnipotent and omnipresent. How many people hear that as something brand new? Brand spanking new. God, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. They are long-standing attributes assigned to a deity. And yet, some of the greatest teachers stopped the notion that that omnipotence, that omnipresence, that omniscience was localized in one single entity. And they described that that entity is everywhere. If it is omnipresent, isn't it expressing in all of us? And that's the twist. Jesus, a character that many people know about in Western culture, said to his followers, you will do things greater than I have ever done. He was saying the buck doesn't stop with me. The great things that I have been able to accomplish, that has been in the context of relationships. Jesus responded to people who came to him seeking support. The bleeding woman, she had gone to every possible doctor. She had had everybody say, you must have done something really nasty to be bleeding like that. She didn't come to him and say, Jesus, can you help me? I've been to every doctor. No, 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 no. She just believed that if I just touch the outer hem of his garment, I will be cured. She was in a place of faith. She was in a space of consciousness about what was possible. She saw unlimited possibility available. And she reached out. And Jesus noticed it. That here was this outpouring of faith. And in this outpouring of faith, there was this receptivity to immense potential, to immense power. So the notion that it's all in spirit, that it's all in somebody else, that's what I want to challenge you today and invite you to consider this week. How much power, how much possibility, how much potential can I tap into? That's truly the foundation of creativity. That's truly the foundation of art. That's truly the foundation of beauty. Isn't the whole notion of beauty that it takes our breath away? That we were going along and suddenly we're just stopped. We're filled by seeing something that is beyond what we could have imagined. That there is a potential beyond what we knew. And yet here we are seeing it. And it sets a new bar. It sets a new height. And isn't that why so many people have tried to write about those moments, or share those moments, or photograph those moments, or paint those moments? And in theology, those moments are called the numinous. It's really touching that unlimited. It's touching the divine, and it's experiencing the divine. And it's knowing that it can happen at any moment. It doesn't require a certain menu of things that have to happen. It's one of the things that's lovely about many of the religious stories. You hear lots and lots about very well-disciplined people. But you also hear about people who just out of the blue are struck by the divine. It's one of the really interesting things about the story of Paul. In the New Testament, Paul was not a Christian hero. He was actually a Jewish person who was a Roman citizen whose whole mission was about capturing others, getting them down. And yet something knocked him off of his horse. Something blinded him, and he was utterly changed. He hadn't been praying, please let me change, I don't like who I am. We don't hear that in his story. We hear that there was this moment, this numinous moment. So the fact is that it's available to anybody. It's not that we are required. It's the notion of grace. Amazing grace. That person who was the captain for those slave ships didn't earn his way because he got one extra slave to America. It was that he survived the storm in the midst of his movement, and he understood life in a new way. Seek that infinite potential. Let all of ourselves be open to the prospect of being overwhelmed, of being touched. Again, like I said, it does not require a series of spiritual activities. However, the consciousness of it does make it more possible. Because how many times does something good happen and we're just like, well, that's not really, that's no big deal. The minute we dismiss it, we are doing the same thing as when that judge in that meat store said, well, you don't get a prize. Let go of the judge. Let go of the jury. And give yourself a place to express. And so it is.